Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. That means it's gardening time. Let's talk gardening for the next 90 minutes. And today, let's think about the scientific method in gardening. Now, I don't want you to think too much about school, what you had to do to make your lessons. This is more how we're going to approach the activities in our garden with enjoyment as we try something new. There are a lot of reasons why we all garden. A lot of us start gardening with the idea that we're growing to grow food for our family. Or maybe we want to get out and exercise a little bit and be in nature. Maybe we just want to grow flowers and have a nice place to sit and enjoy. Whatever the reason, I think as you continue on your gardening journey, at some point you should begin experimenting. If you just do the same thing all the time, it's enjoyable. But when you find something new, I think it can become more enjoyable. And it's the experimentation that a lot of us, especially me, really like about gardening. Because when you think something might happen, and then you work to see what the results are with an experiment, you might surprise yourself, and it may change how you garden from that point forward. So as we discuss this topic today, I look forward to hearing what you all have done and are doing and will plan to do in the future when it comes to gardening experimentation. John Jude had already pointed out some of what he's been doing in the garden with his tomato growing, for instance, trying 10 different ways of growing the tomatoes to include transplanting into a sunflower root ball. That's a great idea. I like that basic concept of, hey, I want to try to find the easiest way to garden, so which approach should I take? And if I'm growing a lot of tomatoes, let's try to figure out which is the best way to grow my tomatoes. So I'm going to see if I can actually pull up the comment here as I see a lot of people checking in. There's Tony from Simplify Gardening. Tony and I were together on a live stream yesterday, so if you missed that, go ahead and check out Tony's Simplify Gardening channel. We were talking about raised beds and in-ground beds. And it's one of those things that there's something about these live streams. I know Tony and I had a great time yesterday, but just the opportunity to be with you all and answer the questions and chat and spend some time with fellow gardeners is just great. So check out that live stream that we did. It was last night for Tony. It was yesterday afternoon for me, and it was a great chat. And we came up with an idea actually for a collaborative video that we're going to do next year. So look forward to that. And we're always looking for new ideas. So if you've got something that you'd like me and Tony to do together, go ahead and throw it in the comments. And Tony will be on this channel live, not just in the comments, in the months ahead, because it's always great to have Tony here with us. And we'll probably have Eli back. I saw that In the Garden with Eli and Kate has also joined us today. Must be an early day at work, so glad to have you here, Eli. And I had a great time with you on the channel earlier this year, so I'd like to have you back, along with a lot of others. So I think this is going to be one of those things in this upcoming year as I experiment with my channel. One of the things I want to do with the live stream is have more and more live guests of all different types. So look forward to that. So when I talk about experimentation in the garden, I suggest, and what I'm encouraging you to do, is to actually follow as close as you can the scientific method. Now, depending on which source you refer to, the scientific method has 5 steps, it might have 6 steps, it might have 7 steps, but it all begins with observation. You're out in your garden and you're just wondering. And then you ask yourself a question. And I had a couple of videos that I followed this basic guideline, regardless of how many steps, over this last year. I was actually at the store and I saw a bag of pinto beans and I was wondering, can I buy this bag of pinto beans and plant them in my garden? That's the beginning of it. can I plant pinto beans in my garden and get them to grow? Then from there, you move to a hypothesis. And so my hypothesis was, yes, I suspect that you can do that. So my hypothesis will be that if I plant this pinto bean from a bag from the supermarket, it will grow. And then you start the process to see if your hypothesis will prove true. And most of it is just regular gardening activity. I sowed the seeds, I took care of the plants, I waited until the flowering and the pods and then the harvest, and sure enough, my hypothesis proved true. I could grow pinto beans from a bag from the store in my garden. That's as simple as it needs to be when you're thinking about experimentation. Now, did I have a daily log? No, but you could. Did I do much more than just take care of the plants any differently? No, but you could. Did I have any type of different activity in my garden? No, because what I was trying to do was minimize the variables. Just treat it as though it was any other seed. The only thing that was unique that I was really experimenting with was the source of the seed. And so as you start thinking about the experimentation in the garden, if you are really looking for specific results of a particular activity, minimize the variables and try to focus just on that task. One of the things that Tony and I were talking about yesterday in his live stream was the raised beds and the soil temperature in those raised beds. And Tony raised the point that raised beds warm quicker in the spring. And I actually countered because I had done some measurements this early spring, and I noted that at least in my garden, the in-ground beds warmed at the same rate as my raised bed. So that's what Tony and I are going to collaborate on in the spring. We're going to measure the temperatures in our respective gardens to determine if the hypothesis that we each have is true. In Tony's case, his hypothesis is raised beds warm so faster and better in the spring. Mine is that the raised beds don't warm any differently than the in-ground beds. This is experimentation. This is one of those things that we will each be following a very similar process as we measure the temperatures in our bed to determine if either of us is correct, or maybe both of us might be correct, because maybe there's another factor that we're not aware of. Maybe it has to do with the air temperature or the humidity or the moisture in the soil, to include rainfall or snowfall. So this is one of those things that Tony and I, within the last 24 hours, have decided to do in our garden as part of experimentation. So what are you doing? Gardens Happen is saying, I split my okra between two different ways of rejuvenating the soil in the pot before planting to see if one did better. There you go. Very simple. And I've done these type of things a lot. And I bet you have as well, without necessarily thinking of it as experimentation. You want to grow a plant, well, grow two plants and grow them in two different ways. And that will help you determine if one of those ways is better than the other. Now, the results of a single experiment may be so profound that it really changes the way you garden. Or it might just pose more questions and encourage you to do more experimentation. Bettina is experimenting with overwintering peppers, hoping for an earlier start to the season next year. That's a great experiment, and that's something I haven't done, but it's on my list of things to do, because in my area, I always get a late start with the peppers. I usually get a harvest, and usually a pretty good harvest, but I'm wondering the same thing. Can I overwinter my peppers to get an earlier start, which may give me a bigger and better and longer harvest of my peppers? So that's a good experiment, Bettina. I'm glad you're trying something along those lines. So Francis says, a relative newbie here, so everything is an experiment. And so I would say I think there's a difference between learning and experimenting. So for new gardeners, yes, everything is new. For you, everything is just something to increase your gardening knowledge. As you get more and more knowledge, where the experimentation comes in is not learning something new, but taking something that you already know and then seeing if doing it differently or in a new way is better. That's kind of how I approach experimentation. But there's also a lot of stuff that I think of like a new gardener that I've never done before. And in that respect, yes, experimentation for the purpose of learning is definitely a good approach. And so the greenhouse, for instance, is a good example in my garden. I have not ever had a greenhouse in my backyard garden. And so everything I do in it is new and could be seen as an experiment. But I'm not necessarily growing the things in my greenhouse for the purpose of experimenting. I'm doing it for the purpose of learning how to grow things in a greenhouse. And so it's a slight difference in how you might want to define it. But the point is that just do it. Get out there and try new things like Andromeda Deluxe. I've experimented with several types of irrigation for my desert climate before setting on the Oya pots. Took an entire season before figuring it out. Good for you. I actually started a video on the Oya pots. I constructed a few of them this year, and I decided not to do the video because I'm going to use them in some of my new metal raised beds as part of filling the beds. I don't have a video on that yet. But the Oya pots are a clay pot, for those of you that don't know, that you fill with water, and the pot is buried into the soil, into your garden bed. And so you'll fill the Oya pot with water, and the water will gradually seep through the clay sides of the pot. And so it's a pretty effective way, especially in desert climates, for keeping the soil consistently moist, because the water is always seeping through the sides of the pot and keeping the soil around that pot nice and moist. And you can have them in all different sizes. So yeah, Andromeda Deluxe, great idea, especially for those of you that might be in a challenging area and you're trying to figure out the best way to garden with a particular challenge. This is a good example of that, experimenting with something new that you may have never done before, like an Oya pot. Great idea. So look forward to that video in the future. I actually have them sitting on my deck right now because I constructed, I filmed, I was going to do a video on how to make Oya pots, and then I thought, well, no, I really should include not only how to make the Oya pots, but how to use them in the garden. So you know me, I like to just pack information into my videos. So that's why I didn't release that video this year. I'll be releasing it next year instead. But that's definitely a great idea. Rachel says, thank you for bringing back elementary school science fair memories. My favorite project was growing plants. Yes, that could have been a bit prophetic. Interesting. And, you know, and it's one of those things, I like science. I've always liked science. I liked science in school. It's just part of who I am. And so when I get in the garden, I have a scientific slant to a lot of the ways that I look at gardening. And I enjoy it. And so that's why I encourage others to do it, because I think for many of us, school doesn't necessarily bring back pleasant memories. And so we avoid some of those things like scientific experiments that may not have been fun when we had to do it in school. But when you get to choose the subject and choose the hypothesis and choose the experiment that you're going to do, I think it's a lot of fun. So hi, Yankee Sister Homestead. Hello to you. And of course, Jay and Heidi are along with us as wonderful moderators today. So always great to see everybody. Let's see. Lion in My Garden says, I have a Carolina Reaper ready to pick in my living room right now. That's great. The Carolina Reaper is one of those hot peppers. Beautiful, beautiful fruit. Of all the hot peppers that I've grown, I think I've had the most success with the Carolina Reaper. And this is one of those things years ago I treated as an experiment. can I grow hot, super hot peppers in my garden? And I actually started growing them in the greenhouse at the school, the Galileo School Garden, and had great success. The Carolina Reaper is just an absolutely beautiful pepper. I grew these peppers just to see if I could grow them. Honestly, they're too hot for me, so I wasn't growing them to eat. I was just growing as an experiment to see if I could, and I discovered that indeed I could. Now this next year I'm going to be growing hot peppers not as an experiment because I already know now that I can, but I'm going to increase the number of hot peppers that I'm going to grow with the intent of discovering ways to use them to make a chili powder or maybe to make a hot sauce. And so this is a great reason why I think experimentation can lead to new ways to garden, because it started as an experiment. I had great success with my hot peppers, and now I want to do more. And it's just one of those things that now I just got to choose the varieties and decide how many plants I'm going to grow and where I'm going to grow them and what I'm going to do with them after I grow them. So none of those deal with experimentation. That's just part of the gardening, but it did begin with something like a Carolina Reaper in your living room. That's all part of the indoor growing. I have my grow tent partly for the reason, again, partly experimentation. Can I grow peppers indoors in my grow tent? But mainly it's demonstrating to myself that indoor growing is a viable option. And that's partly experimentation. So there's always lots of fun things that you can try. Tony's saying, if you love pepper stuff, you guys should check out Chili Chump. Brilliant stuff on peppers. Chili Chump is a channel, great channel on YouTube. And I've actually watched a lot of Chili Chump videos. I'm going to be doing a video here. I'm not sure when I'm going to release it. So I've got all the footage shot for a chili pepper sauce that I've made with fermenting chilies. And I've learned a lot from Chili Chump. So I completely agree with you that he's one of my go-to sources for growing the chilies. So hot peppers, go to Chili Chump. Thanks for that suggestion, Tony. I completely agree with you. Okay, let's see. Yeah, Coastal Gardens is agreeing that it's a great channel. Completely agree. Two Gals Vermont Homestead with Gail is saying, I'm experimenting with more winter sowing. Awesome. Some seeds didn't work last year, so I'll try some others and many more flowers. And so this is really a good point. I like this idea. I do a lot of experimenting once because I keep trying to learn as much as I can about gardening. And so for me, winter sowing began that way. Can I use winter sowing methods? And I have a video where I show some of the winter sowing in the gallon jugs. Can I do that? Will it work in my garden? The seeds that I choose and my severe winters, will it work? It began that way for me, and it worked okay, but it didn't work as well as I hoped it would. So I reverted back to my normal methods of sowing flower seeds and starting plants indoors and then transplanting them. So I really didn't pursue that as a second experiment. As Gail points out, take it to a second experimentation. If it doesn't work out as you anticipated in the first year, repeat it, try it again, maybe change a variable or two and see how it does in that second year or that third year or that fourth year. There are some things that I've done over multiple years, but I'm just all over the place when it comes to trying new things in the garden. So kudos to you, Gail, for doing the same thing again and trying to see if you can get better at it and perfect it a little bit more. And yeah, Heidi, I completely agree. Pepper Geek is the other great pepper channel I like. And I don't know him. I love his channel. He's actually on, when I said that I'd like to have guests for this upcoming year, I'd actually like to have him on the channel. He and his wife work together often on the Pepper Geek channel, and they've got some great videos too. They really know their peppers. They just had a video recently where they reviewed, I think it was their top 12 peppers of this last year. And most of those peppers were peppers I've never even heard of before. So I was taking notes about which hot peppers I'm going to be starting this year. So, that's part of the experimentation as well, is finding the information. It's not necessarily you create a hypothesis and then you just go out and blindly have a garden experiment. There's more information that you'll need to find. You might have to learn how to do some of the things that you want to experiment with. And so as I move forward with this next year in deciding that I'm going to be growing more hot peppers in my greenhouse, a partial experiment, I want to figure out which varieties of peppers are good ones for me to try. And Pepper Geek has been a good source for me in trying to figure out some of those sources. And so don't think that you have to figure it all out on your own. You can watch my videos, you can watch Tony's videos, you can watch Eli and Kate's videos, you can watch all the channels that you like to help you in your journey in trying to figure out which approach you should be taking as you try some of these new things that are happening in the garden. So Prepper Chris is wondering my thoughts on 2-liter bottle greenhouse. Are they as good as a normal greenhouse? And so I don't have any personal experience with a 2-liter bottle greenhouse, though I had seen some of the videos on using them. With any greenhouse, with any structure, and greenhouse I think encompasses an awful lot of variation in structure. And so if you go to Tony's channel, for instance, on Simplified Gardening, he has some videos that he did this year where he constructed what I would call a hoop house, but there's different names for them. But that's the way he gardens. I look at that as a greenhouse. It's a structure covered in plastic sheeting. My greenhouse is covered in plastic as well, but it's not the sheeting, it's actual panels. And 2-liter bottles are an option as well, a different type of plastic. The idea is that you have some type of cover over your planting area that helps generate heat during the day and then hold in that warmth in the evening so that the plants have a warm environment that's protected from wind and weather and extremes in temperature in particular. And so even with the 2-liter bottle idea, like I said, I don't have specific experience with that other than what I've seen on YouTube, as probably that you have seen as well. But there's really no reason why it shouldn't work. Anytime that you can have some type of covering, plastic or glass, anything that follows the same basic guidelines that we would say in a greenhouse should work. There are other factors, of course, but the basic covering really doesn't matter that much. Bubble wrap is one of those things. You may have seen some of those videos to help insulate a structure that is covered in plastic, and you add bubble wrap as extra insulation. Sure, it all comes down to what materials you have and how much effort you want to take in applying them, or take the approach that I took, which is the polycarbonate panels that have 2 panels with air in the middle, and so it creates its own insulation. And so I don't add bubble wrap or anything else, but lots of options. So that's not necessarily a good specific yes or no answer there, Chris, but if it's something you want to try, I say go for it. And that would fall in the experimentation arena for me. If you want to try something like a greenhouse, the traditional way of making a greenhouse is like Tony and I have done with a structure that's covered with a material that's protecting our plants. If you want to try something different, I would put that into the realm of experimentation, because there's not always a lot of good research or necessarily a valid source to identify if that's going to work best for you. And so sometimes you just have to get out there and try it. Gardens Happen says the smaller space could be an issue with the 2-liter bottle compared to a regular greenhouse where a plant can get bigger in it. And that's a good point. the size of the plants and what you're planning to grow is often a big factor in all of this, be it a greenhouse or a hoop over your raised bed that you cover. You definitely have to keep that into account whenever you're trying something new and deciding what approach you're going to take. Eli says, I did an experiment on bubble wrap in my greenhouse a couple of years ago. Definitely seen a difference. And that video was actually what I had in mind when I was referencing the idea of the bubble wrap. There's some really good greenhouse videos on In the Garden with Eli and Kate. In fact, I think your most popular video is the one where it's some good advice on what you should be thinking about before you start your greenhouse. So check out that video and that channel as well. And so let's see what else you have going on that we can talk about and decide that we're going to experiment with. Bohemian Herbology Natural Solutions says Harbor Freight used to have a polycarbonate one for around $1,000, best I've ever seen. Yeah, they can be expensive, and so that's one of those things, and that's one reason why I experiment. A lot of my experiments deal with, can I find a cheaper way to garden, a less expensive way to build the beds or to grow the plants or whatever it happens to be. And Harbor Freight here in the United States is a company that sells a lot of different products at reduced cost compared to a lot of other places. And if you're looking for videos on how to construct the kits, the greenhouse kits, there's a whole bunch of videos on there about the Harbor Freight greenhouse kit, because it's pretty popular, partly because of the cost. Francis says, last season I grew at least 4 of the same crops in both the old in-ground garden and 2 new raised beds I just built. I wanted to see how the newer environment stacked up. It was great. Awesome. Great experiment. That's one of those things that we may not think of as an experiment, but it really is. And this is the experiment I do almost every single year. I grow the same plant in different areas. And so I'll have the same variety of tomato and grow it in 3 different beds with 3 different trellises. And so, sure, I've got different variables, but what I'm trying to figure out is a bed and a trellis better than another bed and trellis? And you can do this throughout your garden with all kinds of different types of plants. So to do it, and 4 of the same crop in different beds, great experiment. Great way to approach the concept today, is to try something that you can visually see. When I was doing biochar, first learning about biochar years ago, biochar is a pure carbon amendment for the soil that has some wonderful benefits. I have a video that I did a few years about it. And so I was working with a biochar company and doing some experiments at the Galileo School Garden to determine how best to use biochar. And I took 4 beds and I applied the biochar in 4 different ways, and the 4 beds were all right next to each other. You could visually see the difference. You could stand at the junction of those 4 beds because I planted the exact same plants in the exact order in all 4 beds. So the plantings were identical. The only thing that was different was the application of biochar. And the results visually spoke for themselves. The biochar that had been inoculated with a nice amount of compost and allowed for the bacteria to grow over time did the best. The bed that I hadn't inoculated the biochar at all and I used dry biochar as an amendment did the worst. And so those kind of experiments can actually be a lot of fun when you have no idea what's going to happen. And so you try something 4 different ways, and especially if you can do it side by side, it really is literally eye-opening to go and your eyes go wide when you see the dramatic differences, if you could have in a type of experiment where the differences are going to be a lot of fun to actually get out and enjoy as you're doing it. So sunset gazing, your soil test raised bed in ground would also depend on location and the sun's angle of hitting locations and also wind conditions, if the sun is restricted from one area opposed to the other. And yeah, that good point. And that's why when I try to do experiments, I try to keep the variables as close as possible, like putting the beds right next to each other. But there's an experiment in itself. If you are looking to see how the weather changes in your garden and what the variations are, do an experiment on that. Grow the same plants in different areas where everything is the same except for the wind and the weather. And that may be an eye-opening experience as well. That's why I built a whole garden area that I could cover with hailcloth. Because of my experiences with hail and weather in my area, I decided I needed to just create a whole new garden that was protected from some of those weather factors. And I've been using that protected area, again, to grow the same plant in different sections inside that protected area and outside the protected area to see which might do better. So I have a lot of fun with experimenting. And so it's one of those things that it can be a lot of fun. Sharon Smith says, my family garden successfully overwinters his chilies in a greenhouse. Another great channel. In fact, my family garden was on our live stream yesterday. One of Tony's moderators was my family garden. So another good channel that you can consider checking out, and some good videos, especially the chilies. I've seen the overwinter chili video that he does, and it has me thinking along those lines that that's definitely something I want to do. And so let's see, I'm going to scroll and see what I can catch up on. Steve is saying, I'm in 5B. Can I winter sow onions? Absolutely. In fact, I didn't do all the filming that I had planned to do to make a video. I decided to just go ahead and winter sow my onions. The most success that I've had growing onions in my 5B garden is with the winter sowing. The idea that you just put the seeds out when it's cold, you're not expecting them to grow, and then you wait and see what happens. And in my experience, when I do that with my onion seeds, they always turn out better. A lot of it has to do with the germination temperatures and the amount of time that onions typically need to fully grow. And so for those of us in zone 5B in particular, we have really cold winters, and the ground tends to stay frozen for a long time, and then it warms up, and then we decide to put the onions in either as starts or as seeds. But when you do winter sowing, nature takes care of all that for you. And so when the temperature of the soil is right, those onion seeds begin germinating. And so I've found that the dates I select to start my onion seeds in spring tend to be 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks later than the time that the seeds actually start growing when I winter sow. So go for it. I'd say winter sow some of your onion seeds and then turn it into an experiment. Save some of your seeds to sow in spring and see what differences you identify between the winter sowing of onion seeds and the spring sowing of the onion seeds. Brian says he puts his biochar in hot compost. Great option. In fact, I think I mentioned that in my biochar video. The inoculated biochar does better than the biochar that's not inoculated. And to inoculate it with the bacteria that's in a compost pile, you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The biochar is not going to decompose. It's going to stay as a nice carbon structure for the bacteria to reside in. So when you use that compost in your garden, the biochar is already inoculated, already mixed into it, and really becomes a great amendment. So that's a good way of doing things, Brian. I think you're right on track. So Lisa says, Gardener Scott's videos on biochar are the best. So informative. Well, thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. I discovered biochar about 15 years ago. And actually, I don't really upkeep my gardenerscott.com page, but there are some old blogs. I used to blog before I started doing videos. And I do have some blogs, actually, when I was working with one of those biochar companies and doing some different experiments. So thank you. Yes, I like my videos, but I also have some articles online if you search them. But they're quite old. The information hasn't changed that much, but the blogging is definitely old. Chris says, fun fact, hardiness zones move not crazy amount, but they do. Yeah, if you look into the history of hardiness zones, here in the United States is really where they began from the USDA back in, I think, in 1963, 1964. And they are periodically updated because they do change. And so it was 97-ish, 98 that they were updated. And then I think we had our most recent update about 5 years ago or so. And actually, I think it might be longer than that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we don't have hardiness zones within the United States change within the next 5 years, a whole new map being drawn, because it's all based on the historical meteorological data. And that data typically goes back 30 years. And so as that 30-year window shifts forward, we've all recognized for the most part that our winters are warming in many regions. And so that 30 years of average data is going to change with the increasing temperatures. So yeah, sure enough, you can expect that some of those hardiness zones will change. But, and I think I've talked about this before when we talk about garden journals, the hardiness zone is based on the lowest average temperature in your winter. And so in my case, zone 5B means it's minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about minus 26 Celsius. I've had in my mind been thinking that my winters are warming. And so I actually started kind of along the lines of experimentation, documenting my temperatures. That's one reason why I put up a weather station recently in that video I did a few weeks ago, to see what my actual temperatures were in my garden. And what I found over the last couple years is that, yes, even though overall the winter is warmer, we still had at least one day that was minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 3 years. And so I think we may see a difference in the average over time, but we still hit those crazy low lows in my garden, even though overall everything is changing. And so that's also part of the experimentation, is keeping the records, keep accumulating the data to determine if what your hypothesis, like in my case, I thought my hypothesis was that I bet I could start growing zone 6 plants in my zone 5 garden. And once I started accumulating the data, I realized, well, that might be a little bit risky, because I'm still seeing those zone 5 temperatures, cold temperatures. So when you assume something, it helps, because you'll start to see things that will either substantiate or discredit what that assumption happens to be. But when you start actually accumulating the data with a quasi-scientific method approach, you might actually surprise yourself. Hi, Lisa. Thank you for that super chat contribution. Thanks for your great channel and for the wealth of info you provide us with. That's why here I just love doing that. So thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. And always good to see you here as well. So Chris is wondering how my trip was. So I did a video a few days back on my vacation. I jetted away for a long weekend on the beach in Mexico, just south of Cancun on Riviera del Mayo, and it was fantastic. But as I showed in that video, I was still thinking about gardening and looking at the plants and couldn't get away from making a video, because that's just what I like to do. But the trip itself was safe and fun, and we had a great time. And so thank you for asking. It is always nice to be home again. It was snowing when I left, and it was snowing when I got back. And so it was kind of rough to have sunburned feet in an area where the snow is falling. So that was kind of fun to return and think about how warm it had been when it was so cold here. But always, I miss Mala, so I had to get home and get mala and get back to everyday life. But thanks, it was a good trip. Not planning anything like that in the foreseeable future. Maybe in February or March I might be taking a trip again. We'll just have to wait and see. I haven't had good experience with the trips I usually do my trips in the cold months because, like most gardeners, when it is warm outside and we're growing, we tend to be chained to our gardens. And so I don't do a lot of long trips in the spring and summer and early fall, and I tend to focus on the winter months. And these last 2 years in particular, I did February road trips. This last year, the video I did where I went to the Greenstock factory, I did that on that February trip. And when I went to Baker Creek Seed, I did it on the same trip. And so I may do something like that on this next February trip. But each time I've done it, a road trip like that, the weather has just been terrible. So I'm not a big fan of driving through Texas in the middle of an ice storm like I did 2 years ago. But sometimes you got to get where you're going, and the way to get there is through a bunch of ice. So Francis says, what were the cute little critters you showed in your holiday vid? So that's a type of raccoon. And on that panel that I showed where I was talking about how in those gardens they actually describe what's in the garden, most of it I think is in Spanish. But that's a Mexican raccoon, and they were all over the place. Really adorable little creatures. We had one that climbed up on our deck, and there were others. I tried to film. There are like a lot of raccoons here in the States that we have. They'll find the trash cans, and so whenever I'd be walking by, I'd see one jump in or jump out of a trash can, and I'd try to quickly grab my phone to film it, but I was never fast enough. But they live all around that area, I guess, and just really nice, beautiful, cool looking creatures. Check out that video if you don't know what we're talking about. The Mexican raccoons were all over the place. So thanks for asking. So okay, let's see. Let's scroll back and see what other questions we have, or the experiments. Again, let me know what kind of experiments that you are doing, or that maybe you might be interested. If there's something that you don't think you have the knowledge to do, or aren't sure how to attempt, put it in the comments, because I'm often trying new things based on suggestions from all of you. I grew black cherry tomatoes this year because a lot of you had suggested them, and I loved it. It's one of those things that we all can find new ideas based on what you all are suggesting. So suggest some of that stuff in the comments about what you're growing and other things that maybe you would like to see me do a video about, or maybe me try to experiment with, because I'm always trying to find new things. Francis says, no one here in my zone 5B area starts shallots in the autumn. I read up and wondered, so I've planted some. We'll update in the spring. Good for you. I've been doing the same thing. I got just so many of these ideas that never come to fruition, so I put them off for another year. But I had that as part of my plan. I bought shallot seeds to grow shallots indoors, to then put those shallots in the ground in autumn to see how that would work in my garden. So I had the same thought. I'm glad you actually did it, because for me it was just a thought that I had, and I'm glad you actually carried forward and are doing it. So yeah, definitely give us an update in the spring to see how well they did, and I would be interested to find that out, because I've done research on it, and I've read and I've watched the videos, and it looks like it's going to work. I'm just not convinced it's best for my area, which is why I want to try it. Karen says, I did a bioassay test with 2 different types of pea seeds to test possibility of herbicide drift. That's a great experiment. And I've talked about that in the past when, and I think I mentioned it in my aminopyrrolid video. If you suspect herbicide contamination, there are ways for you to determine if your soil is indeed contaminated. And growing pea plants is a good, quick way to determine if your soil is contaminated. So good for you, Karen. That's an experiment. It's an assay test, biotest, where you're using a plant to determine the condition of your soil. What's better than that? And it's easy. It's just simply putting a seed in the ground and then waiting to see what happens. So that's a good one. I really like about that idea. Paul says, I'm about to begin the most exciting experiment of my life in 2 weeks. Christmas Eve will be my last day at work. Well, congratulations for you, Paul. That'll definitely set you up for experimentation in a lot of different ways. I hope that means you're getting more time to garden and more time to do some of the things that you want to do that do not include work. That is a nice thing for those of us that have reached that point where we're retired. Retirement does not mean you stop working. It just means your work is usually of your own choosing. I have been busier in my retirement than I ever was in my working career. And so I don't have a problem with it because it's all stuff I like doing. And I'm busier because I like doing it. So retirement is not always fun and relaxation. A lot of times it's fun and work if you can actually find a way to do that. Gardens happen. Last year I experimented with growing a tomato that can't handle my summer heat in my winter, and it worked out well. So there you go. Yeah, often, and that's one reason I wanted to start talking about this today, because many of us will be ordering seeds soon. And the experimentation often deals with what type of plants we're going to grow and selecting the varieties that may have a hard time in our area, or we're selecting and seeing if they'll do well, or selecting varieties that are based on the verbiage in the catalog will do well in our area. So selecting the right variety for whatever the right reason happens to be is important. And many of us are starting to get our seed catalogs and we're starting to choose our varieties. And so choosing a variety that you're not sure about, that's experimenting. Absolutely. You may be doing everything the same. The soil is the same, the bed's the same, the weather's the same. The only variable is the variety that you're using in your garden. And yeah, that's also part of the experimentation mindset. So Francis is a new member of the Gardener Scout community. Welcome, Francis. Look forward to seeing you and some of the perks that we have, to include the members only Facebook page. I hope to see you sign up there. If you don't know about the channel membership, there's either a join button that you might see below this live stream right now, or in the description below, there's a link where you can become a member at different levels. And there's some fun little perks that we have. And it is a great group of members. And we will occasionally have members only activities for that. And you don't lose out by not being a member, but you do gain a few things if you want to be a member. So that can be one of those fun things to participate in. We do have a great Facebook group, and we share videos and photos and stories and all kinds of stuff that you really can't do on YouTube. That's one reason why I like to have it. So Rob's allotment channel, win the lottery first, mate. And I don't do it. That's funny. There's a lot of things that we could do if we won the lottery first, but sometimes we just have to persevere and move forward. So Heidi has a good warning. Everyone be careful out there. Deer are everywhere. Vehicles and deer are not a good thing. You know, and even if you live in an area where you don't think you have deer, you might have deer. My first year here in this house that I'm in now, it's been a little over 3 years, I didn't think I had many deer in this area. I occasionally saw one, but now I see them all the time. And my last house, I had a bunch of deer, and I saw them from the first day I was there. And absolutely, it's one of those things that you learn. Hopefully you won't learn the hard way, but you learn when you have or hear of friends that have hit a deer and you see the damage to the deer and to the car. Yeah, just best avoid it. So be careful out there, drive slowly. The same with winter conditions. A lot of us are experiencing some crazy cold and crazy winter conditions. Take your time. Gardeners generally are patient people. We have to be patient to have success in our gardens. Well, take that same patience in your daily life and just take things a little bit slower, a little bit safer. Drive slower, drive more carefully, and that'll give you more time to get out there and be in the garden. Lie in My Garden says, I'm experimenting growing jigsaw peppers and small tomato plants indoors over winter. I started from seed in October and have some flowers on both. That's fantastic. That's great. You have to let us know how that turns out. I've tried that with regular sized tomatoes, starting them early, and found out that I can't do that because of my late springs. I start tomatoes too early and the plant becomes just too big to transplant. And so I learned that the hard way. But the peppers in particular, and small tomato plants, or plants that aren't going to get that big, yeah, great idea to start those indoors well in advance so that you have a nice mature plant by the time you're putting them outside, or just leave them indoors and continue growing them indoors and have your peppers flower and fruit long before you even put them outside. That can actually be a fun way to do it as well. Okay, let's see. Gardens Happen says, my aunt was using deer fencing on her roses. It looked like mesh netting. It seemed to be working. That's good. A barrier is usually the best way to do it. And I found that something as simple as just bird netting, which is a mesh netting, is often all that's needed to keep the deer away from the plants. So deer definitely can be a problem. Urban Chicken Mama has a good point as well. They actually make these little things you can stick on your car that as you're driving, it creates a really high-pitched sound that only the deer can hear, so they can hear the car coming. And I've never used them, but I understand they can help if you drive in an area with deer. Brian says it needs a recommendation for a patio indeterminate tomato for a balcony for a gardener friend. Patio is actually a variety that is sold almost everywhere in the springtime. I see patio, that's the variety name, patio tomatoes sold, and it grows into a pretty compact plant and actually does pretty well. I think my daughter grew the patio variety on her balcony when she was in college. And so that's the one that pops immediately to mind that I know personally has done well for her. There's also, look into some of the paste tomatoes. You might have some good results with some of those, like Romas. Romas tend to be a pretty good patio kind of tomato that you can grow. So anyone else have a determinate, and you're saying indeterminate for a patio balcony, but I think it really should be a determinate because you don't have to worry about trellising. You can just grow them in a pot. But if you do want an indeterminate on a patio, take into account that there should be some type of trellising. But for someone who just wants a pot, patio is actually a variety that I know has worked out pretty well. So, okay, let's see. Rob's Allotment channel is suggesting Crimson Crush. I actually haven't grown that one, so that's an interesting one to be thinking about. Hassan's wondering, when should we start sowing summer vegetable seeds, February or March? So it completely depends on when you're going to be putting those plants in the ground. So for me, here in Colorado, in my Zone 5B winter, I can't start anything in February or March. It's way too early because I'm not putting any of those plants into the ground until late May or early June. And so a lot of it depends on when your garden is going to be ready to start growing, how warm your soil temperatures are, and if you have a frost, when the last frost date is. And so for most of the seeds we're growing, and I actually have a video that I did this last year where I go through a lot of the different vegetable plants in the garden and give a guideline of when to start them. And no doubt Jay's looking that up and we'll give a link here pretty soon. But for example, cucumbers and squashes are typically started 3 weeks before your last frost date. Tomatoes are started 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. Peppers are started 10 to 12 weeks before your last frost date. And all the other plants that we might be growing fall typically in that range between 3 weeks and 12 weeks. And so check the seed packet, because the seed packet will usually tell you when to start seeds indoor in relation to your last frost date. And so I can't answer that question specifically, whether it's February or March, because that doesn't match with my garden, and I don't know specifically what your weather and climate is and when you'll be putting your plants in the ground. So figure out what your last frost date is, and then check the seed packets to back up based on the vegetables that you want to grow, or check out your local nurseries or any garden experts that you can find in your neighborhood to find out when they do it. And that's usually the best way to do it, because we're all different. Some of what you may be starting in February, I'm not starting till April. And there are others that are indeed starting them in March. So it does depend on our individual gardens and our individual climates to really give the best answer for that. And I talked about that a couple weeks ago. I'm still seeing videos. You probably see some of them too, especially from San Diego, where they're just now starting some of their winter crops, or maybe they're a month into starting their winter crops. My window closed a long time ago for winter crops. In fact, it's been August is typically when we start our winter crops here in Colorado. So September, October, November, December, we're 4 months past the point that I would be saying to start the winter crops for me. And there are others that are just now starting their winter crops in Southern California and Arizona and Florida. And so we're all different. And so there can't really be a single answer that applies to all of us. You just have to learn what's best for your particular area. So Lisa says, I actually grew Kellogg's breakfast on the patio. It's a huge indeterminate, but it did amazingly well. Big pot and staking well. I also kept it pruned. I love Kellogg's breakfast. Big, beautiful orange tomato. And I've done the same thing. I had the best results when I was growing it in a greenhouse, and I kept it nice and trellised and pruned well. And so it's one of those things that if you haven't tried that variety, give it a try, because like Lisa's saying, it did amazingly well. And it's a really beefy and good tasting tomato, but the orange color is really wonderful. So Bohemian herbology. I get antsy and plant too soon every year, just can't wait. Then they get too big indoors in the trays. Those are great time estimates. Got to have patience. Absolutely. And if you haven't made that mistake yet, you will. We all just don't have the patience and end up starting our plants too soon. That's one of the things I'm experimenting with this year. And so the general guideline on a packet of seeds for pepper plants, for instance, is 12 weeks. In my experience, the plants are transplantable if I start them 12 weeks before my last frost date, and then I usually wait at least 2 weeks after that date before I put them into the ground. So my pepper plants are usually at least 14 weeks from when I sowed the seeds to when I put them in the ground. And they all do great, and I get a harvest, and the plants are wonderful. But every year I think that the plants are just smaller than I would like them to be. And so I'm experimenting with that this year. I'm going to be starting my pepper plants 2 to 3 weeks earlier than I have year in and year out, to see if growing a bigger plant and then transplanting that bigger plant in my garden has a noticeable difference. And so, yes, sometimes that anxiety, we got to get out and get those seeds started, can be turned into a valid experiment. When is too early and when is too late? Because I've had the opposite problem where I start the seeds too late and then the plant just isn't big enough at all and the transplant doesn't survive well. So it's finding that happy spot that really is the goal as you try to start figuring out some of these new ways of doing things. Sherry says, I have one of those Clyde's garden planners. It looks like a slide rule and advises when to start indoors, when to plant out for different zones. I have one of those too. It's off for me by about a week, depending on the plant, sometimes 2 weeks. But those are great tools. If you can find a garden planner or a garden guide like the Clyde's, and you just slide it back and forth and it gives you an idea of when to start your seeds, go for it. But like most guidance and information, to include mine, it may not always match you and your garden. So try it, make notes, collect the data, and then determine if it is appropriate or if you need to make some modifications. And the same with the seed packets. When a seed packet recommends that you start seeds 4 to 6 weeks or 10 to 12 weeks or whatever it happens to be, that's just a general guideline based on average gardens and average conditions and average results. And not all of us have an average area. Some of us live in a far from average climate or far from average soil structure. And so it's okay for you to make modifications. If someone advises and suggests, take the information and try it. And that's part of being a next level gardener, is to modify it so that it fits with your particular style of gardening and the things that you want to do in particular. So while I'm thinking about it, let's talk about the background today. This comes from Wasabi Gal, and you may remember that she sent us a picture of her garden earlier this year when things were green and growing, and talked about the shed and the layout of the beds at that point. This is just a beautiful garden area. I love the patio and the sitting area, and I really like this design. I talk about this as often as I can. Whenever I see a chair in the photos that you all send me, I like to point it out because I think sitting in your garden and enjoying your garden is a great aspect of gardening. And so the center area here, where it's all brick and they have a table and a chair and the beds surround that's ideal. And that's actually my garden design. I haven't built that structure yet. I haven't put in the brick. I don't have the chairs yet, but that's all part of my garden plan. The center of my garden is a sitting space, and all of my garden beds will surround it. So you can sit in the center of your garden and just be exposed to all of it. So I love that as a garden design. But I really like the picture here because it shows now, and this picture is actually a few weeks old, but the beds are cleaned up. The plants are gone or dormant. You can see all the leaves have fallen from the trees in the background. And so the garden is being put to bed. But what I love to see, because my garden looks the same way, is this high trellis right here still has the dead plants on them. And I love that because that's how I garden. I'll clean up most of my beds. I'll get everything amended and looking good and add the mulch or add the cover crops. But when it comes to a lot of those vining plants that are growing up the trellises, I just leave them in place over the course of the winter. Sometimes there are seed pods that I intentionally leave for the birds, but in actuality, a lot of it is I'm just tired or lazy, and I'll get to it in the springtime. I focus on the soil and cleaning up the beds, and I'll get to the dead plants that are growing up the trellis. And so it's one of those things that I change what I'm doing in the garden based on the time of year and the importance of the activity, and cleaning up the dead plants on the trellis usually falls very low on the list. So I'm really glad to see that. And I see the comment from Yankee Sister. Yeah, having a grill is also another great idea. The grill right in the middle of the garden space. So you've got your chair and your table. You're surrounded by all the growing, all the plants. You grill yourself up some dinner and you eat in the garden. I've done that in the past as well. And I just love that idea. And then there's also things that, again, are just like my garden. These are cattle panel trellises, it looks like, throughout. And same thing, when you're done with some of the trellises, you stick them in the back corner, you lean them up against the fence until next year. And so I really like this because this looks like how I do a lot of my gardening in laying out the beds and using the trellises and the basic garden design and the cleanup, and then how I just store everything to the side until I use it again next year. So thanks, Wasabi Gal, for sharing this with us. And send me your pictures as well as we're moving into the winter, or for Patrick or Rick in Australia, if you've got things that are actively growing, send me your photos so that we can talk about it in the weeks ahead. We don't often do a lot of talking about the gardens in winter and what they look like in winter. I think winter is a great time to plan the expansion of your garden because everything is laid bare. You don't have plants in the way, so you can see your beds, you can see your trellises. Mala's here saying hello. You can really get a good focus. There she is. Say hello to everybody, Mala. I'm ignoring her. Okay, you can get off now. And so that was nice of Mala to come visit. But anyway, in the winter, it's a good opportunity to start thinking about what you're going to do as far as your garden plan and your garden design, because everything is bare. And I'd love to see the photos of what your garden looks like when the plants aren't growing, because we can really use some of that analysis to help all of us out. So send your photos to Gardener Scott at gardenerscott.com. Give me specific permission to use your photo, and I'll do my best to add it to the queue for all of us in the future. So thanks everybody. Thanks Frank for saying hi to Mala. She's still here, so I think she can hear me talking. So yeah, there you go, Yankee Sister. You can see the bones of your garden in the winter. Exactly my thought. There's so much about the winter that really we should be using more of, and I'll be talking about that at the end today. So yeah, I agree, Jay. Gardener Scott needs kisses. She reminds me when I sit too long or get focused on an activity that often doesn't involve her. She comes up and gives me kisses to remind me that she needs loving as well. So that's fun. And Chris is saying he wants more Mala. So it's interesting. I do it mostly on purpose, and I did this with Lily too. Most of my videos have, my older videos, it's Lily. My newer videos, it's Mala. Most of my videos have them somewhere in the video. Often it might be just the top of their head below a plant, but that's one of those Easter egg kind of things that if you look really close at most of my videos in the garden, you'll be able to see either Lily or Mala, and Mala does her best to walk in the background in a lot of the shots I'm filming in the garden. So you'll definitely be seeing a lot more of Mala in the future. Joe's crayons. I really like cherries. I just don't like the big ones that have seeds in them. I like the ones that go on top of sundaes. However I plant the seeds. That's funny. Cherries are one of those that I'm going to add back to my experimentation. I grew long before I knew a lot about gardening. Close to 25 years ago, I tried growing cherries, and I grew 2 different types of trees, and they just didn't do well in my environment. Black Tartarian was one of them, and Bing was one of them. Both great varieties that should have done well, and they didn't. And so now at this new house, I'm trying to figure out an area to grow cherry trees, choosing a variety and choosing the methods that they'll survive my winter and do well in my area, but we'll see. I don't mind the stones. I actually have one of those kitchen tools for pitting cherries, and I've never used it. But if I grow cherries again, I've got the tool ready to take the seeds out of the cherries. I'm like you. I prefer to get the cherries that are already pitted, and I can throw them into my sundae or ice cream or cocktail or whatever it happens to be. So that's great. It's always nice to try that. Bohemian herbology animals are always helpful. Mine are too. And she's down at my feet. Another hello to you, Mala. So that's funny. So Mala's a good garden dog. She is a bit mischievous. In the bare bones of winter, plants are laid bare, particularly my trees, And even when I've got the fencing and the netting around them, Mala likes to chew on them. So we're still working on that. She likes to chew on the same things that the deer like to chew on. And so often the deer will do damage, and then Mala will come along and do more damage. So I'm still working on figuring out the best way to protect some of my plants. So, okay, let's see. We'll get back to some of the questions now. Llama, I never liked maraschino cherries. When I was a kid, I thought they were fake cherries. That's funny. You know, the color really is unique, and the sweetness is a little extreme. They do have their purposes, but try growing your own cherries. That's the cherries you grow from your own trees. Like everything else in the garden, tastes better than anything you can get in the store. There's just something about growing it all yourself. Coastal crocus, good old Nanking cherry is extremely hardy. You know, and thank you for that. I did put in some Nanking cherries at the Galileo Garden. So at the Galileo Garden, I was growing hardy kiwis and the Nanking cherries, but I retired from that job before the plants got big enough, and I haven't been back in the last couple of years to see if they're fruiting yet. But yeah, that's a good suggestion. I did discover the Nanking cherries and put them in that garden. Honestly, I hadn't even thought about putting them into this garden. So thank you for that suggestion, because that may be the approach I take when I start figuring out the cherry trees that I'm going to put in. So good idea. Sherry says, deer come right up to the edge of my back porch and eat what falls out of the bird feeders. Not sure how I keep them out of the garden when I get my high beds built. Do exactly that. That was one of the best methods I had at my last house. A lot of deer. And one of the things that helped keep the deer out of the garden was that my neighbor had 8 or 9 bird feeders. And so when the deer would come in, they would tend to hang around that area because it was easy food. And they tended to stay out of my garden. I just put up a couple low fences. I never had deer eat any of my plants in my garden, even in the areas that I didn't have fences. Never had a problem with the deer eating. And we're talking, when we moved into that house, our first day, there were 12 deer bedded down in our backyard. And we put up fences, and we had the dog, and eventually they lessened, but they would walk through every day until Lily would come out and scare them away. Never had an issue with them eating my garden because they were almost always eating the birdseed. So you could use that to your advantage. Add a couple extra feeders in an area away from your garden, and the deer will probably prefer to eat that and probably won't bother the plants that you're growing. Some barriers definitely are an advantage. Some fences, some hoops and netting over the beds themselves can help, but give them another choice, and they're probably going to take the easy choice if it's easy food. Definitely something to think about. Cheyenne, Wyoming urban gardener, fence your garden and run cucumbers all around the fence. Cucumbers grow easy, and the vines are poisonous to deer. I have squirrels and rabbits like crazy, and no issues. I have a 1-foot fence. That's a good idea. I'm not aware that the cucumbers were poisonous to the deer, but there's a lot of other plants like that as well. That there's kind of 2 ways to approach it. And I did this in my front yard at the last house as well, is growing those plants as a border, which adds to the barrier to keep them from coming into the main zone, or as a food they really like. And so I did that, though it wasn't as effective as I had hoped. Tulips, for instance, are a favorite food of deer. And so I put tulips in one area of my garden, one area of my landscape completely away from the garden, with the idea being that the deer would eat the tulips and stay away from all the other plants. The problems were that the tulips flowered earlier than everything else and only flowered for a very brief period. And so while I achieved the purpose of keeping the deer away from my main landscape and garden area, it was only effective for a brief period. Whereas something like cucumbers and a lot of other plants, I grew rosemary for the same purpose. Rosemary was effective as a deterrent for the deer. I had rosemary and sage plants and lavender growing all around the edges of the beds that I wanted to keep the deer out of, and it worked pretty effective. So yeah, depending on the plant that you have in your area, like Cheyenne Farmer says, it can be an effective method to try to keep the deer away. And you don't need tall fences. And a lot of times they come across those plants and they just keep on walking. They won't step over those plants in a lot of cases. So it's a good way to kind of guide them into another area. And I did a lot of those type of things to guide the deer away from my house into my neighbor's yard. And you know, they didn't have the gardens I wanted to protect, and they weren't gardeners. So why not direct the deer over to their landscape? So Tony says, create a living edible fence. Love that idea. There you go. Yeah. Fences don't need to be wood and metal. You can make fences with plants. It's really a fun way to make the approach. Sherry says, one thing I know the deer won't touch is my asparagus. Some of it escaped. It's growing wild where the birds planted, and the deer are not interested. I have my asparagus growing right next to a number of different plants, but the raspberry plants are right next to one of my asparagus beds. Same thing. The deer don't touch my asparagus, and I never had problems with them eating raspberries at any of my other houses, but the young bucks that have come to my yard nibble at the tops of my raspberry plants. So even if they've got thorns and little pricklies, like we're told they're not going to eat it, they do eat my raspberries, but they don't eat my asparagus. So there you go. There's an edible fence that you could have to help keep the deer out, is to grow some asparagus. I have the same experience that they really don't like it. And Light in the Garden says hops. It is a beautiful plant. Hops are on my plan to grow in the back section of my garden. They have a resin in the flower that gives them that antibacterial property that is why they're used in beer, and also that tangent, or not tangent, that astringent taste, if you were to take it and actually try to use it in something that you're cooking. And so the tannin flavor in the hops, it's bitter for us, and it's bitter for deer as well. So yes, you're right. That's another living fence that can keep the deer out, is hops. And it is a beautiful plant. I had hops at the Galileo Garden, and they were 10 to 12 feet high. I built a huge trellis to grow them straight up, and beautiful plant, beautiful flower. And you get that resin on your hand. I love the smell of hops personally. I like beer, so probably no surprise. I like IPAs, which is even less of a surprise when we're talking about the hoppiness in our garden. So good suggestion there to add hops to the garden. And so let's see, back to the idea of experimenting. All of these ideas, if you didn't think about growing asparagus outside of a particular bed, if you'd never thought about growing hops, all of these things that we're talking about, these are probably, I'm guessing for many of you, new ideas. And so think about them as something that you might want to try this year in your garden. This new idea, you've never done it before. You can have a hypothesis about what you think might result based on what we're saying or what other information you gain from your research, and give it a shot, especially if you've got a deer problem and nothing else is working. The idea of a living fence, either as a food smorgasbord that attracts them and keeps them away from the garden, or as a barrier, very effective ways to deal with deer. So try it. That's how I've discovered a lot of the stuff I'm doing, is to try some of this stuff. Bohemian Herbology says hops are on the list as well. Brewing at home, total bonus. My son actually has a YouTube channel, and he does beer reviews and beer videos of all different types, and he's planning on shifting his channel focus. It's the Brew Captain, and he's going to shift his focus to brewing at home, and we've talked about that. So he's done a couple brews and some really good beer, And so as he learns more about brewing, that's why hops are on my list, because I'm planning on growing hops so I can supply my son with the hops he needs to make his beer, or at least some of his beer. So total bonus, completely agree. There's lots of great ways that you can help yourself in the garden and maybe help out with some of your other hobbies like beer making. Do the whole thing, absolutely. And I agree with Margin. Hops are very easy to grow. I have a plant for 3 years and now it won't die anymore. They are. You'll typically buy them as little rhizomes, little root sections, and then you plant them and they're perennial. They come back every year. And so once you pick the right spot, especially if you have a trellis set up that is a permanent type of trellis, easy to grow, beautiful plant, and I completely agree with you. It's one of those things. It takes a couple years for them to become established, but you're right. If they're 3 years old, it's a lot like asparagus and rhubarb. Once they get established, they're almost indestructible. And they're really easy to propagate because you start them from little root cuttings. If you want to expand your hops bed, you just dig down and take out some of those root cuttings and you've got a whole new plant to grow in a different section of your garden. So there you go. I think that's something we can all learn today. Let's grow hops. It's got a lot of advantages all the way around. And so let's see, it's phenomenal. I'm going to check it out. Brewing beer and making your own wine would be super satisfying and fun. It really is. Now, I'll expand that beyond beer and wine. The apple trees I'm growing, I think I've got 8 or 10 different varieties. About half of them I specifically chose for the purpose of making cider, a hard cider. And so, yeah, you love gardening, you love trying new things, you love experimenting, expand into everyday life. If you like wine, if you like beer, if you like cider, figure out a way that you can incorporate your love of gardening with those type of activities. Now, I'm still 3 to 5 years from harvesting enough apples that I can make a cider, but I've got patience and I've got time and I've got that vision, and I'm growing those varieties that are recommended based on different sources that you should be growing for a really tasty cider. And so the hard ciders are different than the sweet ciders in that the apples that are grown for cider are usually not good eating apples. They're very tannic often. They have that astringency, but they can make some really good cider. So believe me, when that time comes, you'll be seeing videos about how to make cider from your own apples. In my case, it'll be my apples making my own cider, but I'm already planning those videos years from now because I'm growing those apple trees right now. It's all part of the big plan. So figure out what your big plan is, and you can definitely start thinking about it right now as you're choosing your varieties to grow and whether you're going to add trees or add plants of any different type. Now it's really a good time. And even if you're just starting, like those in the Southern Hemisphere, that your plants are in the ground now or about to go in the ground, go ahead. It's not too late in many cases to do some of these new things and start with some of these new plants that you might want to try, like hops. It'd be fun to see how many of us actually take that on. I may ask that question in the months ahead to see how many of you decided to grow hops based on today. And here in the States, at least, or at least my part of the country, Oregon produces a lot of the hops that you would buy to put into your garden. I actually, for the Galileo garden, ordered some from Oregon, but also on the west side of Colorado, they have hops that are grown, and I found a pretty good source for the hops that were grown. I think I had 3 different varieties. Cascade is one of the varieties of hops that is very common in beer making. And so when you go to look for the different reasons of why you would grow hops, if it's beer making, kind of like the apple cider, you want to choose the specific types of hops that do best in the different types of beer. So it's all gardening education, all stuff to learn. all things that you probably need to check out at some point. You may not think so now, but stick it in your bag of tricks for the future. And so you probably, I don't know if I've ever said this before, but I kind of in this mindset right now for myself. And so I want to throw it out to you. Sometimes you need to force yourself to garden. Now, I love gardening. I know you love gardening. We love a lot about gardening. And to say force yourself to garden just seems odd to be saying that. But what I find usually at this time of year for me, the days are cold, the winds are extreme. We actually hit 105 miles per hour in a windstorm that we had recently in my area. It's not go out and garden kind of weather. It's stay inside and read seed catalog kind of weather. And I often suggest at this time of year to start your planning, to start thinking about experimenting, to choose the varieties that you're going to choose. And what gets forgotten is the garden, actually the outside space. And as I already pointed out, especially if you've got a sitting area with chairs and a table, don't forget that. Don't ignore it. Even though the weather is cold, force yourself to garden. Force yourself to get outside into the garden. Because if you're at all like me, and I suspect you are, the garden space just makes us feel better. And so we coop up indoors. We think about gardening. We educate more about what we're going to do for ourselves in our garden. And we're not in our garden. And that energy that our garden gives us, even in winter, even in the depths of winter, it's still there. We just need to go out and find it and suck it up so that we can sit indoors and still have some of that gardening spirit, some of that gardening energy that the outdoors garden gives us. And so I particularly, and I was gone last week on my trip, and I came back, sitting on the warm beach was wonderful. But just walking through my garden, even though everything is dead and dormant, it was a wonderful feeling. In many ways, it was just like sitting on the beach. It was that energizing feeling that I'm where I like to be. And so the ground is too frozen for me to get my fingers into it. And I can't spend a lot of time out there, but I still have to get out there. And sometimes you have to force yourself to get out into the elements, into the cold, into the wind, into those conditions that you may not necessarily like. And so if you haven't done that yet, if you haven't been in your garden recently, get out there and get in your garden. Even when there's nothing growing, even like this picture right here, this is still an inviting space. My garden is still an inviting space. There's just nothing growing. Your garden doesn't have to be actively growing for it to be beneficial to you. And that's the message I wanted to convey today, is especially new gardeners tend to think that the garden is only a garden when it is actively growing. And I counter that with the garden is always the garden. There's always something to see in the garden. This time of year, it's the bare bones of the garden. In the middle of summer, it's when all of the flesh is on the body and everything is wonderful and you've got the colors and the clothing of the garden, so to speak. Right now, you're seeing its nakedness. And don't shy away from that. I think it's kind of fun to see a naked garden and to soak up that energy and to get re-energized so that when I do come in and I look at the catalogs and try to choose what varieties I'm going to grow, my garden is fresh in my mind. The placement of my beds, how I'm going to grow next year is right there at the forefront of my brain. And now I can sit inside, nice and warm, and figure out what I'm going to do. So get outside, get in your garden. Don't ignore it in the winter. It's still the garden. It looks different, but it's still the garden. So get out there and enjoy it. Yankee Sister Homestead, it's always nice to see you here. And it was nice to see you yesterday on that live stream as well with Tony. I love gardening. I love watching your channel. Always a hit. Thank you, Gardener Scott. Well, thank you, Yankee Sister. Thanks for that super chat. It's always nice to have you here and everybody else every Monday. I will say just in advance, I was trying to decide one way or the other with the holidays approaching, and I will have a live stream on the day after Christmas. So 3 weeks from today, the day after Christmas, I am planning to be here. Now I know there's lots of travel and lots of family that you may not be interested in being here, but I'm going to be here. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that I am planning to have a show. Even if no one shows up, I'll be here on the Monday, that day after Christmas. But I'm not planning to be here on the day after New Year's. And so, or I should say on New Year's. So though I'll be here on Christmas, I'm not planning on being here on New Year's. That's actually my daughter's birthday. And it's one of those days that a lot of people may not be fully recovered from the night before. So I'll give you all a break on January 1st. But if you're wondering, I'll be here through all the holidays every Monday from here on until the end of the year. And I look forward to seeing you here as we share ideas. And I look forward to hearing from you all the time with your ideas of what you want to do and also what you think I should do as we move into the next year. So hope this is a great gardening week for you, even if it's cold and snowy and windy, or even if it's warm in one of those southern areas and you're out in the garden actively. Get out there and enjoy that you've put it all together and that it is your special space that you can benefit from. I'll be back in a week, and I hope to see you then. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.